Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks, Wendy. So, speaking from the point of view of the CDAC network review, it certainly agree that commitment from senior management to listening to communities and ensuring flexibility within programmes needs to exist to adapt according to community feedback and concerns. And this certainly came through in the review. And I'd also add to that that having dedicated staff responsible for accountability and continued dialogue with communities who are actually a key part embedded within programme departments came out as being really important. So community feedback was really being solicited by staff making programmatic decisions. I think depending on what we mean by tools and mechanisms, they can offer support in data collection, analysis and organisation, and also presentation of data. But if people in key decision-making positions aren't interested in this this feedback coming from communities, the tools and mechanisms are useless and ineffective.
Okay. Alex, what about you?
Great, thanks, Wendy. I think it's a fascinating question, and Barb's in such a great place to raise it and try to respond to it because of what she did in this response. And I think it gets right to the heart of this question of, so within the Haiyan response, were we kind of successful broadly in terms of improving accountability or not? And it seems to me that's still a bit of an open question, and I certainly hear both sides of that quite strongly. So there's been more and more effort on accountability. It's been described as more the response that's had the most effort on accountability, AAP, than any. But there's still a lingering question mark of, okay, did this really achieve what we thought it was going to achieve? I think there's a number of aspects of what Barb says that's interesting, given where she's come from. The leadership role she played is crucial, and I'm sure we'll come back and talk to that. And I think that was a really important step forwards. The focus on tools, we know that there were many hotlines and many help desks and many other accountability mechanisms set up, and probably those had some real benefits for some of the people who were engaged with them. But we also know that there are real questions about who engaged with them and on what sorts of issues, and the extent of their influence. So broadly, I do agree with her that we need more of the focus on leadership and a consistent attention to the underlying principles and practice of just talking to people and being responsive, rather than diverting that attention onto very concrete tools.
Thanks, Alex. Olaf, do you have a view on that question?
Well, actually, when I worked there, I looked more at the early warning aspect and the preparation for the incoming storm, and not that much in the coordination and feedback and responsibilities after the disaster. So I cannot contribute much to that, actually.
Organization, whether you've focused on any of these issues, accountability to affected populations. And you're going to talk a bit about the communication side from the government's perspective later, I believe.
I can say a lot about that, but during my time with Capacity Building International, I was also not looking at this area.
Okay. Mike, what about you?
Thanks, Wendy. I think we're in danger of sort of agreeing with ourselves on this one. I think, from my experience of what I saw in the early days in the Philippines, it's quite clear that if you have sort of field workers whose job is just to go out and fill in forms, that's what they'll go out and do. If you have a sense of leadership and if you have a sense of mandate and commitment across the whole organisation, to accountability, that's when it's most effective. That's when it becomes a flexible approach. That's when people adapt it to what they need and to the culture and the context. And I think we saw this in some places in the Philippines. One of the things, sort of speaking from the partnership side of things, working with local organisations and local NGOs, is I think we saw very much in the Philippines a very politicised local civil society with many people coming from their roots in the days of the struggles against the Marcos regime and such like. And that meant for a lot of them actually sort of listening to the voice of the poor, listening to the voice of those affected by the disaster was actually something that came quite naturally to them. And yes, they they then needed to sort of work with us on tools, and we saw different partners finding different ways because it fitted their culture or fitted the culture of the communities they work with. But the issue of the principle was less of a challenge there than it has been in some other responses.
Okay, I want to move on to looking at some of the specific issues that our various authors have raised. And Alex and Nicki both authored articles. Anne Street, who works with Mike and others on the Missed Opportunities, or Missed Again report, also authored an article. But Alex, in your article in particular, you note that the Philippines environment presented many opportunities for enhancing accountability to affected people, that there were also many obstacles. And could you tell us what these were and how the Plan, World Vision, IOM, Pamatakiti project hopes to embrace the opportunities and address the challenges? And maybe tell us, obviously, a bit about the project itself.
Sure. And I guess a lot of people here would also know a lot about many of these issues, so I look forward to the broader conversation. In terms of the opportunities, let me just pick out two, or maybe three. Let me pick out three. So firstly, it was such an enabling environment for this sort of work, to try to enhance accountability in a major disaster response. Mike mentioned previously the very established civil society. We know it's a middle-income country with sophisticated media and a whole set of sophisticated systems already established for citizen accountability of one sort or another. It's well rehearsed, I think, those areas. The nature of the emergency, of course, also created other opportunities that as a rapid onset natural disaster, it's relatively manageable compared to many of the other humanitarian situations we work in. But thirdly, I think another area of opportunity was the level of attention given to accountability, AAP, downwards accountability, across the sector. I think what we saw was that this is recognized as being central to what we do, even though we perhaps still have scope to do it better. And again, I point to Barb's deployment as an incredible opportunity, as deployed as the AAP coordinator by OCHA. It was OCHA? It was OCHA. So with in a position to provide leadership on CWC at the cluster level. That was an incredible opportunity. If I had to pick out one of the two constraints, let me pick out again two very familiar constraints. None of this is very new. One constraint is the sheer volume of work that staff were trying to undertake in the amount of time available. That we know that in a major response like this, the pressure to scale up and recruit staff teams and win funding and elaborate proposals and get organized and deliver aid of some sort or another is massive and is overwhelming. And in fact, is almost an impossible pressure, and we have to keep that context in mind. And then a second constraint, as a directly related part of that, is the fragmentation across the humanitarian sector. So different agencies, as we know, tend to work rather independently. Any initial response tends to be chaotic, but then trying to enhance that level of coordination, well, it gets better over time, but we're still talking about coordination between independent entities. And naturally, any very large effort that's undertaken by a whole lot of separate organizations, that's going to create a lot of different pressures on field staff. So those are some of the constraints. In terms of what we were trying to do with Pamatakita, which continues today, the idea was to think, well, could we have collective approaches? Could we offer collective tools to different agencies which would enable them to meet their common commitments? So whether there's a commitment under HAP or SPHERE or potentially now under the core humanitarian standard, could we try to address some of these constraints and make use of some of the opportunities by developing common approaches rather than each agency investing their own time and money, and crucially staff time as one of the most constrained factors in developing their own approaches, which had to be contextually appropriate, etc. So at its most simple, we were saying, well, what about a common hotline? Rather than having 20 different agencies with 20 different phone numbers that people have to call or text, wouldn't it make sense from a community point of view if there was just one number? Which is a very appealing idea, but as ever, turns out to be a little bit harder in practice than we hoped. And in fact, also to be a little bit more limited, I think, in scope than we'd originally envisaged because of the limitations around the use of hotlines. But it could go on, and we were thinking, well, if there were other common tools that could be used, like common feedback mechanisms, could these also generate the benefits of, or even common feedback, questions and questionnaires? Could this build, again, on some of the work that Barb set up, where she was running, as it were, sector-wide, response-wide workshops, to try to generate a broader view about what local people thought about the response? I can talk a little bit more about where we got to on that. And one of the interesting things with Partikita is that we're now thinking more about how do we support other established accountability mechanisms rather than trying to set up our own. And in fact, that could be others that are run by government or by independent radio stations rather than run by humanitarian agencies. So how could we support local accountability mechanisms? Which I think is a very interesting line of thought. And again, there were particular possibilities in the Philippines.
Yeah, Alex, you mentioned the core humanitarian standard. And I mean, as we all know, it's recently been launched in Copenhagen on the 12th of December. And I think you said in your article that it could offer a realistic way of, using this approach of implementing the standard and possibly, presumably, verifying or measuring against it. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see that, how that would work?
Right. So in plan, we're going to adopt the core humanitarian standard. We're not quite sure what that means in practice yet, and I think we're probably in a similar boat to many different agencies on that. I know I've been talking with World Vision and Oxfam, for instance, and they're basically in the same boat. As SAVE, we know, is adopting it. So the question is, internally, if we just looked, first of all, within plan, how do we firstly help our teams around the world to understand what the standard means and what's expected from them? And then how do we help them to meet the terms of the standard? And then how do we assess performance in some way? We need some kind of verification and assessment within the level, probably, of individual programs. Now, if we could develop that mechanism for verification in the same way alongside other NGOs, that would be great. And we could then have some kind of common mechanism for verification. So that would address one of those points of fragmentation I just mentioned. So if we all say, look, this is how performance is going to be judged, we're going to use the same sorts of criteria in as much as that's possible across very different contexts, but maybe within each single context, then it would generally help contribute to the coherence across the system. And I think that's one of the lessons that really comes out of this experience in Haiyan, that we were aware that this was a real issue, but it was proved again that we have a long way further to go. And verification could take a lot of different forms if you just think internally, whether we're asking, we could use the structure of the CHS to develop feedback questionnaires as just one approach. And we could ask the people we're trying to help, how well do you think we met our international standards? Now, we wouldn't quite frame it in those terms. You need to frame it in terms that make sense from a local perspective. But that would seem to me to be a sensible thing to do. The joined-up approach could bring other benefits.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to turn to Nicki now. And Nicki, your article focuses on the key findings of a learning review, which was recently completed by CDAC. And I wondered if you could talk us through some of the main findings and what the implications are for how communicating with communities is conducted in future emergencies. I mean, and also talk a little bit about how local actors were involved in the CWC work. And if they weren't, what were the obstacles to their participation?
Sure. Okay. So yeah, the CDAC network review. There's some copies around if people want to read it. Looked at both the coordination of communication with communities work in the response to Typhoon Haiyan, and also tried to capture learning and good practice from various CWC initiatives. So the review spoke to key informants from humanitarian agencies, media development agencies, local government and local media, and also held some focus groups and interviews with representatives of affected populations, and also looked at secondary data from CDAC network member agencies and other sector-wide reviews. So focusing first on the findings from communities themselves, the review found that information on agencies' programs and plans was really key, and also how communities could get in touch with agencies was important. However, access to wider news and information was also really key, as well as connectivity between communities, so the ability to connect with friends and family, for whom many, that was their main source of information throughout the response. This is where humanitarian radio programmes proved quite popular, and I can see some of my colleagues who worked on these programmes here today, so I'm sure they'll be able to talk more to that later. The humanitarian radio programmes, and Alex alluded to this earlier, provided a kind of independent mechanism for community dialogue and discussion. They were able to provide useful information about aid distributions, weather warnings. They also played a role in reuniting families in certain contexts and created a space for dialogue and for communities' voices to be heard. The media development partners and the local media really emphasised the importance of not just messaging out, so not just sending messages out to communities, but also really giving a platform for communities to tell their stories and to connect with one another as well. Journalists, so there were two kind of key humanitarian radio programmes, one in Tacloban and one in Giwan, and journalists would investigate communities' feedback and complaints, and also invite humanitarian agencies and government respondents on air to respond to communities' questions and feedback. Humanitarian agencies, we saw evidence of humanitarian agencies seeing the benefit of this as a way of providing information to communities, but also enabling dialogue. And there's a case study that comes along with the review about Radio Abante, which was a radio station in Tacloban, where UN, NGO and media development agency partners actually came together to collectively fund the radio station to stay on air. So as Alex mentioned, to support a kind of independent mechanism to collect community feedback and to be able to, for communities to hold agencies and government to account. In terms of coordination, so Alex mentioned the deployment of Barb Wigley, the AAP coordinator, and there was also a series of CWC coordinators who were deployed in the response to Typhoon Haiyan. This wasn't actually the first time for CWC in the Philippines. This had happened before in the response to Typhoon Bofa, and so the kind of OCHA CWC group were really building on experiences that they'd had before. The review found that a coordinated approach to communication at field level was seen to be important by humanitarian actors in order to avoid duplication and conflicting information being provided to communities, and in order to be able to collectively identify and respond to information gaps. So collectively finding out what people needed to know, and then a coordinated response to provide people with the information they needed. As Alex mentioned, the deployment of AAP staff and this review found CWC staff as well really helped to raise awareness and focus within the response. And as Barb Wigley's article mentions, and as the review mentioned, this really worked best when AAP and CWC staff worked together on joint initiatives, so really pulled kind of technical capacity and skills to get the best results. The AAP and CWC working groups, which were established across the affected area, were seen to be important in raising awareness of communication with the response, as I mentioned, but also in developing relationships with the local government, local media and private sector organisations who could really bring value to the coordination. The review found that in the future, in terms of future implications, that there was the need to kind of clarify the mandate of these working groups and how they actually interact with the cluster system, so where their entry points are. Third kind of part under coordination, really, investment in partnerships was really found to be key. So the fact that the relationships already existed between humanitarian agencies and local media when Typhoon Ruby arrived just almost exactly 1 year later, was really seen to make a really big difference in this response, in the response to Typhoon Ruby. Particularly for local media actors, they found that trust had been developed between local media, UN, NGOs, and collaborative projects were able to be launched extremely quickly.
So the emphasis on building those relationships, building trust, people working together, because it was a conscious decision to merge the CWC and the AAP function, wasn't it, at the field level?
It was, yeah. Colleagues from OCHA can correct me if I'm wrong, but the CWC working group actually existed from very early on in the response, and AAP groups were kind of set up set up alongside. But it was realised that many of the same actors were attending. So many of the NGOs don't have millions of staff to be able to attend every single meeting, and it was often the same people that were attending the accountability working groups and the CWC working groups. So the groups decided to merge and really pool their resources and work together, and launched a number of relative initiatives which were seen to be relatively successful.
Okay, no, that's great. Mike, I wanted to talk a bit about Anne's article.
Yep.
Which Anne Street's article that you'll find in the issue assesses the quality and effectiveness of international local partnerships in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. And her article draws on a recent study I mentioned earlier, which Mike will talk about, Missed Again, Making Space for Partnership in the Typhoon Haiyan Response. There are several agencies involved in that. ActionAid, Mike's agency, CAFOD, Christian Aid, Oxfam, and Tear Fund. There's another article by John Tipper, who works with, I think it's Mercy, a Swedish-based NGO, and he was employed as an advisor by an established national NGO based in Cebu City. And John reflects in his article on the experiences of the local organizations he worked with as they tried to engage with various clusters. They employed him to give them advice, really, on how they could engage with the system. And both Anne and John conclude in their articles that during the Haiyan response, international humanitarian organizations and the cluster system in general didn't really enable local and national actors, including affected people, to lead the response, to take part in responding to their own crisis. I mean, Mike, how do you think agencies can overcome the obstacles to genuine partnerships, to scaling up these partnerships in large-scale responses, and to ceding power and authority to local and national actors?
Okay, thanks, Wendy. That's a difficult one. I mean, yes, what we saw in the work on the Missed Again report was very much what you're saying, that local agencies weren't really getting into the system at all. The reason that report is called Missed Again is because it follows up a previous report called Missed Opportunities, which looks at the situation for local organisations working in partnership with international NGOs or working under their own bat. And I think we have to look at them both in the context of the Philippines, Pakistan, and a few other major disasters. I think one of the challenges that we've found coming out of the Philippines is some of our easy assumptions as to why this wasn't happening were challenged by the situation in the Philippines. In Haiti, it was because the system works in English and everyone spoke French. Well, in the Philippines, the lingua franca for most educated people for this kind of affairs would be English anyway. It was security issues. No, that wasn't the case there in the Philippines. And again in Pakistan and in Haiti, we said, well, it's the mistrust of the outsider. People don't want to get involved because they don't tend to want to engage. Well, I mean, we didn't see that in the Philippines. There's not the same mistrust of the outsider. Although all those sort of easy practical reasons we thought why it might not be happening, weren't really big factors in the Philippines. So it does come back much more to a system. It does come back much more to a culture, whether that's the sort of easy relationships between people within the UN and NGOs who just happen to say, "Oh, you again," or "Oh, your organisation again," and such like. It's about expectations. I mean, I think again what we're seeing is that coming from the response, the research picks up three key messages that need to be changed, and they're not new messages. They're about an enabling environment, one that the model of the system actually remembers to include local organisations from the start. They're about more of a commitment to localising surge capacity, and they're more about what's done in preparedness and prioritising that. And I suppose one of the challenges for the Philippines is it does have a fairly good government-led coordination approach, and that would include local NGOs, but that was taken over by the UN at an early stage because of the size and scale of the response. So expectations of how things would work weren't there, and that gives us another challenge. Not knowing how the systems worked is not a capacity weakness. That's an awareness process. That's something people need to know. But just because you don't know how it works doesn't mean you don't know how to do it. So we can talk about capacity building, and certainly organisations of the South generally need support and capacity building in the humanitarian system, in humanitarian work rather. But just knowing the system isn't the same as not as a weakness in capacity. The other thing is, of course, is the funding mechanism. The funding mechanisms that are set up expecting certain levels of compliance, certain levels of due diligence, certain levels of hoops to jump through, certain levels of anti-terror precautions to jump through, that mean that the funding mechanisms are never set up to reach local organisations. So what's in it for them? I think we've found all those, and the research again points out that these are the things that need to be changed in order to create this enabling environment.
I think John also talks about creating a culture of inclusivity as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And my understanding from reading the article too, and from others I've spoken to, is that some of the local NGOs, certainly the one that he worked with, which was a national NGO, but worked with local partners as well. They had resources. They had money, they had resources, they had relationships. And so they could have actually been very useful to other agencies working under the cluster system, but didn't really know how to engage. They didn't know that each other really existed. There was duplication of effort and duplication of assistance, and then neglect of other areas as a result of that. So I think some really interesting points coming out of both of those.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting because there is an assumption that local NGOs don't have those resources. So our natural thing is not to look around and say, now which is the local organisation that might support us with warehousing or things. Oh, we just assume they don't exist because that's the way it's always been, and we're not catching up with those developments and those changes.
Looking at them always from our perspective, and how can they augment our response. Did you have anything you wanted to add on that? Or?
I think it's such an important area, and that we know the cluster system. It's not exactly a smooth-running machine from which certain people are excluded. It's a rather clunky, overstretched, difficult machine from which quite a lot of people are excluded. It strikes me still that we've been talking about these lessons for a long time. So the 2005 Tsunami Evaluation, the number one recommendation, we all know, international aid system needs a fundamental reorientation from supplying aid to supporting local efforts. Local reconstruction efforts. Certainly I thought that was compelling. And we go back, you can go back and back and back. And so I was involved in a DC evaluation in 2001 of the Gujarat earthquake, and really to all intents and purposes we said the same thing. There are clearly some instances where you do need a UN-led response, for particularly in conflict and particularly in very difficult operating contexts. But as long as we feel that we are trying to deliver aid, we're going to be locked into this system of saying, well, how can you help us? Which is clearly fundamentally wrong. That's the wrong orientation. And we saw that, and I think now the Philippines government has stated that pretty clearly, saying, okay, we're going to take over the coordination of ongoing rehabilitation efforts. The change in orientation that the Tsunami Evaluation Coalition recommendation sets out seems to me is the foundation of this. If we started to think what we're trying to do is support local reconstruction efforts, we would approach our work in a different way, and then things like partnership, or indeed accountability, might move to the centre stage. But it seems to me we'll never be able to get them to the centre stage so long as the heart of the system is all about, we've got to deliver stuff really quickly, otherwise people are going to die, which is seldom true, and wasn't true, or was only true for a very modest proportion of this response.
Thanks, Alex. Before I move to Olaf, Nicki, did you have anything to add?
I just wanted to add a bit, kind of build on Mike's point really. Obviously for the CDAC network, the relationship with local media and the support of local media is relatively important. And despite actually having CWC working groups on the ground from very early on speaking with members of the local media as part of our review, it was still very difficult for them to engage with the humanitarian system, despite their radio stations, their media stations being destroyed. very keenness to help and to be involved, but finding it very difficult to build that relationship, which is why it was very encouraging in Typhoon Ruby to see those relationships already built. We also need to acknowledge the role of the media development partners in terms of being able to bridge those gaps, in terms of supporting media stations to be able to get back on track, and supporting that kind of external neutral accountability.
Yeah, that's an important point. I want to move back to Olaf. Olaf, I'm sorry, we've been neglecting you over the last few minutes. Are you still with us?
I'm still there.
Thanks for being so patient. Olaf, so far we've talked mainly about aid agency accountability to affected populations and how the international humanitarian system engages or not with local actors. And I now want to focus a bit on the role of the government. And in your article, in your experience, you assess government early warning efforts for Typhoon Haiyan in Leyte. And could you tell us, how did the government communicate early warning messages related to the typhoon? And were these communications effective? And also maybe you could touch on what the government needs to do, what you think the government needs to do to make the system more effective and more accountable, and what the government can do to make itself more accountable to people through that process.
Yep. One of the problems that caused a lot of subsequent deaths of people is that the hazard map that showed the area that was storm surge affected was much too small. This meant that actually the evacuation of some people who were located in the hazard area did not take place. It also meant that some people evacuated actually within the hazard area. That means into evacuation centers which were flooded. And then some people died there. So the hazard map in the beginning was a problem. And the second problem was that the government obviously did not make clear enough how serious the situation is. So how strong the winds would be, how high the storm surge would go. Many people said they didn't even know the term storm surge. And I think one other factor is that in the past, sometimes the government exaggerated in warnings, and that means there was a certain fatigue in listening to government warnings, saying, okay, we know storm warnings, we had that before, it's another one, type of getting tired of that. I think also it was to some extent that the government officials themselves did not understand the seriousness of the situation. There were senior government officials at the airport in Tacloban during the storm, and they were kind of paralyzed. I mean, they survived, but they couldn't act because they were completely cut off from any communication lines. After that, the World Meteorological Organization and the UNSCAP visited the Philippines and discussed with the government on how to improve the situation or the early warning efforts. And there was quite much agreement on what has to be done on the technical side. There have to be some improvements. But also one of the main recommendations of the delegation that went there was people in the government have to learn how to laymanize their language, how to address the concerns of people who are not weather experts. And there is agreement on that. It has not yet completely taken effect, I think, but to some extent it has already, but there's still room for improvement. But there is not, say, a big disagreement on that. There's a longer to-do list, but people are working on that, and I'm pretty confident that sooner or later the system will be much better.
Thanks, Olaf. Now you've been based in the Philippines for a long time, and I would imagine you've been involved in or witnessed many other responses. I mean, were you there during Typhoon Ruby? And if so,
yes.
Did you notice, what were the differences in terms of how the response was handled from your perspective?
Well, I looked, of course, again at the early warning aspect of that. Now, there were two differences. One, of course, was that the government was more alert and putting more efforts into evacuations and so on. On the other hand, and I think that was the more important factor, is that the people who were potentially affected were much more aware of the danger that could come. I mean, with the last experience of Haiyan in mind, they were actually asking the government officials, when can we finally evacuate? Which was more or less the opposite during Haiyan, where people said, is it really necessary that we are leaving our home? Now they really went to the mayor and so on and said, okay, when can we go, where can we go, where are we safe? So that was a big difference.
That's a very interesting point. Thank you. I wanted to ask all of you, really, and we can start with Olaf, about whether you think the lessons from the Haiyan experience can be applied in other countries, or is the Philippines a particularly unique situation, given the strong capacity of government, local agencies, and the high penetration of telecommunications and social media networks? I mean, do we think that these lessons can be applied elsewhere? Olaf, do you have any comment on that?
Well, I think from my perspective, the Philippines are a bit different to some countries because they are more decentralized, more different actors playing. NGOs have a big role in the country. This is it's an opportunity, but it's also could be turning into less coordination and so on, because there are so many actors and they are more or less independent of each other. And from my perspective, a lot of the problems in the aftermath, and also those that are still existing right now in the reconstruction phase, are because of the many players involved. And from my point of view, this has to be considered for future actions. And I mean, right now in the Philippines, we also have a discussion. We have this so-called sunset review of the law, where this will be one of the issues. So how can we see that coordination is improved in the future?
Thanks very much. Mike, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I think, as you say, there are a lot of uniqueness around the Philippines in terms of the context of agencies and such like, but also the other part, of course, is the huge geographic spread of this emergency that meant coordination was so complex that the number of actors, the number of local government authorities, for example, that were involved was quite significant. I think, however, coming back to the work on the Missed Again report, it was called Missed Again for a reason, and that's because it was repeating lessons learnt elsewhere. How we see these lessons coming out is different. The challenges can be bigger in some places than others, but the core messages in terms of local organisations and their involvement around sort of the culture of a response that is sort of integrating, that brings them in rather than excluding, around the enabling environment, around preparedness and such like, remain the same. It's the Philippines is unique in terms of context, perhaps, but not unique in terms of issues, and the issues are the same.
Alex?
Yeah, thanks. And there are always lessons to be learnt. I think three really key points for me stand out as lessons from the Haiyan experience for future responses. So one is the importance of investing in leadership. And I think Barb makes this point very clearly in her article. I think it accords with wider experience. We need leadership at the cluster level. So we need some kind of accountability coordination at the top of a UN response. We need leadership within agencies. We need leadership on the ground. So we need to invest in leadership, and that needs to be funded at different levels. The second lesson, I think, is use collective mechanisms where possible. And this is still emerging, but I think there's some very encouraging evidence to build on. So, for instance, the use of the common feedback forms, which CDAC has written up a case study note on, is impressive and I think suggestive about the way forwards. And collective mechanisms, they make things simpler. They make it much more action-oriented, much more likely that people's voices will actually lead to changes in decisions, and hopefully they make systems easier for people in affected communities to use. Should be cheaper as well. So the second one, use collective approaches where possible. The third lesson, I think, is we have such an urgent need to make it simple. Just one of the points that's come up today, that we had this ludicrous split between a CWC working group and an AAP working group. and the AAP was doing PSEA as well, and somebody else was working on gender, and there was age, and you're lost in this alphabet soup. And it all is making a whole lot of quite basic ideas extremely complicated and bureaucratic. And as a result, because we tend to think about these things in isolation for quite understandable reasons, because they become manageable, we make our overall practice worse. So it seems to me one of the main lessons coming out of this is that we urgently need a much simpler and more intuitive language to describe what we're talking about that doesn't create immediately exclusive barriers to local NGOs, who, as we know, are always key actors, as well as soaking up vast amounts of staff time in fighting about, well, shouldn't this be a CWC priority rather than AAP priority, for instance. I think those three lessons could potentially shape a new agenda around this. I think we can still look backwards a lot and say, well, what can we learn from that TEC evaluation? There's a big framing narrative there. We need something like that. What do we learn from the experience of HAP? And then looking forwards, how does this align with the current initiatives around the core humanitarian standard and the build-up to the World Humanitarian Summit? And the answer is potentially very well. So I think an overall narrative that comes together around invest in leadership, use collective responses where possible, and let's find a way to make it simple, really has the potential to move us on a substantial step from Haiyan.
Thanks, Alex. And Nicki?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. That was really interesting. I'll keep it specific to communication with communities. And of course, the Philippines is a very unique environment in that sense, with a very advanced telecommunications infrastructure, high mobile phone and social media usage, high literacy rates, strong communications capacity of local government, local media, and very high capacity in terms of communications of national staff as well. However, much of this infrastructure was completely destroyed in the immediate aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. And while agencies were able to use mobile phone and radio, they still needed to go back to focusing on face-to-face, going out, having conversations with communities face-to-face. And so I think that while the Philippines is a unique environment, I think that the need to assess communities' information needs and the appropriate channels to communicate with communities through will be key wherever disaster is. That always needs to start with an analysis of the local communication landscape. Working with local actors in local languages will always be important wherever disaster strikes. Albeit that clearly the existing capacity and the resources available for the response, of course, made the job somewhat easier in the Philippines.
Thank you very much to our panel, but now I want to open it up to the floor, to the people in the room as well as those online. Questions, comments, observations from you, and I'm sure many of you were involved in people are raring to go, which is good to see. We want to hear from you, those of you who've been involved. Yes, and can you identify yourself and if you have any organizational affiliation, and just wait for the microphone, please.